Welcome to this Al-Monitor Pro webinar on President Biden's visit to the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasiliti, president of Al-Monitor, the award-winning media service based in Washington, D.C., with contributors and correspondents all over the region and worldwide. A few hours ago, President Joe Biden completed a two-day visit to Israel and the West Bank. He will soon land in Saudi Arabia, having flown over Saudi airspace directly from Israel, another sign of the normalization process between Israel and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, he will meet with 9 Arab leaders, the heads of the Gulf Cooperation Council, as well as Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan, to analyze President Biden's first trip to the region as president. We have our lineup of all-star Al-Monitor columnists. Ben Caspit, who's been covering President Biden's trip to Israel, and he's based in Tel Aviv tonight. Daoud Kutab, he's in Jerusalem. He's been reporting on Biden's visit to East Jerusalem and Bethlehem today, including Biden's visit with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Elizabeth Hagedorn, our State Department correspondent, she's based here in Washington, and Jared Zuba, our Pentagon correspondent, who joins us from New York. To all of our viewers, you can ask a question via the Q&A function on your Zoom platform. Ben, let's get right into it. Let's start with you. Biden was greeted as an old friend in Israel. There seemed to be a lot of genuine warmth. You write about that today in your article for Al-Monitor. But top of mind for Israel is Iran. And there were some differences, although there was a joint statement and shared concern about the Iranian threat and an Iranian nuclear weapon. Israel wants more focus on an offensive and deterrent military posture. Tell us a little about the atmospherics around Biden's visit and how the Iran issue played out and what it means for the next steps with the Iran nuclear negotiations still going on. Ben, you're on mute.
Okay, now I'm on. Thank you, Andrew, and it's a pleasure being here with Al-Monitor experts and analysts from the Middle East, covering this historic visit. And as you said, Joe Biden is a very old friend of Israel. It is his 10th visit to Israel. He met Golda Meir 50 years ago. By the way, President Yitzhak Herzog just read him the protocol from that meeting when he was a very young senator. And I think he conquered the Israeli hearts with his authentic love and warmth here in these two days visit. But if we talk about substantial matters, and the 3 top issues that concern Israeli leadership is Iran, Iran, and Iran. So the goods were not delivered. There were a little success when you read the historic Jerusalem Declaration. There was no such a treaty or a declaration or a document between Israel and the United States since 1999. But the Israeli side wanted very much to talk and to convince the president about, for example, a deadline to the negotiation with Iran, a red line, or as General Amos Yadlin calls it, a tripwire. When do we think or decide that the Iranians cross the red line and we have to do something operational that talks about the famous Plan B? What are we going to do if suddenly intelligence will tell us that Iranians are enriching uranium to military grade of 90%, or advancing in what we call weaponizing. Weaponizing is putting the uranium and the nuclear material on a warhead, on a missile. The Israeli side wanted very much to conclude a joint plan, but the Americans are not there. They're still focused on going back to the JCPOA, and the Prime Minister Lapid and also President Herzog and Benny Gantz tried to convince the American side, listen, the JCPOA will not happen. And the deadline is very close. Go straight to what we called longer and stronger, and of course, go ahead with the sanctions. So there were no, the parties are still very far. But I think the Israeli side did not expect that the president will suddenly be convinced. They are very pleased with the decision that I think when he was interviewed by Yunit Levy, he said, no, we're not going to change the decision about the revolutionary guards. And they're very pleased with the warmth. And yes, there was some kind, and I'm finishing, of implied consent that the decision will be made in not too long distance. So we will not drag feet forever. I think the next few months are very crucial to see where this negotiation is taking us.
Thank you, Ben. And a reminder to our viewers, you can submit a question for our panelists via the Q&A function. Daoud, let's turn to you. You were in the West Bank today. Biden, of course, knows Abu Mazen well. And Biden reiterated the U.S. commitment to a two-state solution throughout his visit to Israel and the West Bank. Biden came today to the West Bank with money for Palestinian hospitals, for refugees, money in terms of U.S. assistance, I think $300 million, and some gestures from Israel on travel, internet service, and more. But the mood surrounding the visit to Bethlehem was hardly celebratory, the expectations low. How do you see the visit? What was achieved or not achieved? And what's been the reaction among Palestinians?
Well, as I say, blessed are those with low expectations, for they shall not be disappointed. So Palestinians, the Palestinian leadership had very, very low expectations. What was coming out before the visit and during the visit to Israel was very worrisome. You know, Biden spent 2 days in Israel and 2 hours in the West Bank. So it's a bit of a, I think the percentage of time is a sign of, well, lack of commitment, or maybe not enough commitment. But what I was surprised after I spoke to a very senior advisor who attended the meeting was that the meeting in Bethlehem was very, very warm, and that Biden is trying very hard to bring back the talks to the pre-Trump era. So basically a continuation of the Obama-Biden era. And in that area, they put apparently they put some pressures on Israel to please delay any decisions on settlements in near the Columbia airport. But I think what was worrisome is that Biden said, and he probably was right, that the situation is not mature for talks. Israel is not ready, and it looks like the US is also not ready. The one area of disagreement in the public meetings was the issue of normalization. Biden spoke very positively about the need for normalization because that would help the peace process. Abu Mazen Mahmoud Abbas said that the normalization will actually delay, and it's better to first solve the Palestinian problem. But when I spoke to my source, he didn't seem to worry about that. He said, all our concern is for the talks to come back. We need to give people hope. We need to have a horizon for talks. And so the talks have to go back. That's the big issue. Of course, they also talked about Shireen Abu Akleh, the American-Palestinian journalist who was killed by Israelis. And Biden promised that they will continue to put pressure on Israel to come up with real facts and to hold those accountable. That's basically what happened. The money part was well welcomed, and the fact that Biden spoke in East Jerusalem about the 67 borders and visited the East Jerusalem hospital without Israelis, and in fact, a big scene on Palestinian and Arab social media is when they removed the Israeli flag from his car before it went to visit the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, which was, you know, a kind of a sign that East Jerusalem is occupied areas.
Thank you, Daoud. Jared, what are about the consequences of the agreement signed between the U.S. and Israel, including this Jerusalem Declaration? What's new, and how significant a change are they in terms of U.S.-Israel security ties? And put that also in the context of the meetings that President Biden will be taking place in Saudi Arabia.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's, I think, important to recognize, and as Ben sort of mentioned, it's more style than substance at this point. A lot of what was in the Jerusalem Declaration isn't necessarily new. The U.S. and Israel have been cooperating both at the covert level against Iran over the past few years. Obviously, the declaration enjoins the United States and Israel to use all elements of their national power to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That is already U.S. policy. It's important to recognize, I guess, that really Middle Eastern states, including to some extent Israel, really have wanted to know under the Biden administration what their strategy for the region is. The White House famously downgraded the region in its strategic priorities. They continued U.S. military withdrawals from the region. So if the White House intends Biden's visit to reassure allies and partners, the Israelis now have it in writing, at least in a vague sense. But as two senior Israeli officials recently said, there's value in that on the face. In the background, of course, over the past year plus, U.S. Central Command has been laying significant groundwork for joint and combined military operation between the U.S., Arab states, and Israel in the region. There's a long way to go with that, my sources tell me, but what we've seen over the past year has been pretty significant. I mean, you've seen combined air exercises, you've seen the expansion of maritime cooperation with the introduction of Task Force 59, Task Force 153 in the Red Sea, and of course, there's the intel sharing at the bilateral level between Israel and Arab states. So, in large part from the security side, this trip is mostly about putting a presidential seal of approval on what CENTCOM has already been doing and will continue to do. And this is going to be a gradual process going forward. So we can probably expect to see continued expansion of maritime cooperation, additional, of course, air exercises, and I'm sure there are some other things in store which CENTCOM has. One of the things to watch out for is that obviously, CENTCOM has prioritized air and missile defense as one of the 4 or 5 aspects of this initiative. It's going to be interesting to see how CENTCOM pulls that off. The United States has always, in recent years, struggled to maintain enough air and missile defense assets in the region while focusing, on East Asia, for example, as with the National Defense Strategy. It's going to be interesting to see how CENTCOM is able to enable an integrated air and missile defense cooperation between Israel and regional states, if that is what they are going to do, and how many resources that's going to take from the Pentagon.
Elizabeth, Biden lands shortly in Saudi Arabia. All eyes will be on the choreography of his interaction with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Set the stage for us regarding what Biden and we should expect from his visit to the kingdom.
Right. Well, I mean, I think what we cannot expect is the same sort of imagery we saw from President Trump. We all remember that famous, mysterious glowing orb photo. But, just to take a step back, I think, everyone on this call is, I'm sure, familiar with Biden's campaign promises on Saudi Arabia. And so I won't really get into that or the criticism surrounding his trip. But the sort of question for me on MBS and the human rights issues are, what deliverables can Biden come home with to sort of justify paying an official visit to a country that he previously said deserves to be shunned? And there's been a lot of focus on Jamal Khashoggi and whether Biden plans to address his murder. He sort of dodged that question yesterday, but I would point out that there are a number of US citizens and residents under travel ban or imprisoned in the kingdom. And I think, at a minimum, Biden will probably press for their release. I think it's likely, if not during this trip, but shortly after, that we'll see some steps from the Saudis on that issue. But to your point about the choreography, will we see a photo of Biden shaking hands with the man who US intelligence says orchestrated Khashoggi's killing? I'm sure that's been the subject of intense negotiations between the Saudis and the administration, and that all of those interactions will be carefully watched and choreographed. The White House is, well aware of the criticism that this visit has generated, but I think a photo of some kind is probably inevitable and will be of huge value to the prince. The big deliverable I think we're all watching for is a commitment on the part of Saudi Arabia to boost oil output and which would help bring down prices here at the pump and ease inflation in the US. The White House has really downplayed expectations that this visit could secure more oil production. Biden himself has said that he won't ask Saudi leaders specifically to use their spare oil capacity. His press secretary said it would be a mistake to view this trip as only about oil, but of course, this trip comes in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its impact on global oil prices. So I think it's very possible that they reach some understanding on production for when OPEC's or OPEC Plus's current quota agreement expires in September, but there's a question of just how much spare capacity Saudi Arabia and these other OPEC countries have, and many oil market analysts are skeptical. So that's something that we'll all be watching for here.
Great. We'll now turn to questions from our audience. Ben, we have a question here. Israel has given high priority to steps towards normalization with Saudi Arabia. And we mentioned at the outset the overflight, which is a huge step for Israeli aviation to be able to fly over Saudi Arabia, especially flights between Israel and Asia. Obviously, this is a slow process. What are Israel's expectations, and what do you see as the next steps in the process in terms of what people are saying and leaders are saying there in Israel? You're on mute, Ben.
Okay, now I'm not in mute. First of all, we have to admit that the outcome right now, the goods that were supplied are lower than the expectations. But the declaration about, Israelis had a no-flight zone over Saudi Arabia since the establishment of the state. It makes our flight to a vacation in Thailand 12 hours instead of 7 hours, a lot more expensive, etc. This was just an example. And this thing was solved. And it's an historical event. But Israel expect another announcement within days about the Hajj. 6,000 Arab Israelis every year are traveling to make the Hajj, going to Mecca, and they have to travel to Jordan to cross the Jordan River and then to travel to Saudi Arabia. They will be able to fly directly. And this is a very good announcement as well. But will we see ceremonies? Will we see embassies? Not so fast. What very senior Israeli sources are telling me that the Saudis are not the Emiratis, they are not the Bahrainis, not the Moroccans. It's a different type, a different style, a different format. They need time. The steps are very slow, very graduate. It will be faster when, if and when Mohammed bin MBS, Mohammed bin Sultan, will be the king and the ruler. It is going step by step. But if we're talking about substance, real substance, we have to think about one of the most powerful pictures from this visit in the airport when the President Biden was surrounded by Israeli leadership and generals and the chief of staff, looking at all the interceptors, interceptors of Israel, the Iron Dome, the Iron Beam, a laser system that is now in a very fast lane towards being operational. And this is what the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and all the other players in the Middle East are expecting. And the cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia is very tight. I think Wall Street Journal just featured that a few weeks ago, there was a meeting between Chief of Staff of Israel, General Aviv Kochavi, and the Saudi under American umbrella, I think in Egypt, with many other Chief of Staffs, exactly about this, and also taking this alliance, this Middle Eastern aerial defense alliance, and upgrading it into cyber and naval alliance, etc.
Daoud, a related question for you. The last stop on the road to normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia remains the Palestinian issue. And the Saudi position has been consistent. Its position is the Arab peace plan of 2002, initiated by the late Saudi King Abdullah. Put this process, what Ben's been describing, what we've seen the last few days, especially as Biden goes to the kingdom, put it in the broader context of the Palestinian Authority's relationship with the Arab states, how normalization has helped or hindered these relationships, and what Palestinians expect in terms of their engagement with the Arab countries.
Well, I think one has to look at two things. The whole idea of delaying normalization until Israel ends the occupation was meant to be a weapon to push Israel. It has not succeeded. And the feeling is that by rewarding Israel rather than punishing them for continuing the occupation, is going to make Israel more hesitant in giving up territory it occupied. So the idea is not that the Palestinians or Arabs are against normalization. In fact, the Palestinians have normalized, Jordan has normalized, Egypt has normalized, they have peace treaties. So the idea is not the concept, it's the usage. If normalization brings the peace process faster, fine. But if it delays the peace process and it allows the Israelis to get away with continuing occupation, then it removes another element, another card in the hands of Arabs, and that's why people are against it. But I want to comment on what Ben said about the Palestinian citizens of Israel going to Hajj. The problem is not the flight, because they can fly now from Tel Aviv to Amman and literally land and then continue to the Hajj. The problem is the passport. The Saudis will not allow the Palestinian citizens of Israel to fly into Saudi Arabia with Israeli passports. So they were given temporary Jordanian passports in the past. And I think until there is a peace treaty, there's no way that they can enter into the Hajj area with Israeli passports. That's the problem. So yeah, I think it's a bit more complicated than just a flight issue. What I was surprised when I spoke to my source who was in the meeting with President Biden, was that the Palestinians are not carrying this issue of normalization to its end. They're not pressing Arab countries. They could do whatever they want. All they're interested in is to have the peace process returned. They want a political horizon so people can have hope. Otherwise, they will go into carrying out more and more attacks against the Israelis. So Palestinian leadership really, really wants the talks to come back. And of course, they want the talks to be fruitful. And that's the aim of delaying the normalization, is so that Israel will feel the pressure. If it's not going to make a difference, then fine. But if it's going to help and bring the talks faster, that's what really the Palestinians want.
Elizabeth, a question for you. We'd be remiss, we haven't talked about Yemen. There is a now 4-month-long fragile ceasefire. This has been also an initiative of the Biden administration, also been a key part of the U.S. engagement with Saudi Arabia. How do you see the Yemen process playing out over the next 24 hours or so in the kingdom? I'm sure it will also be a subject of the GCC+3 summit.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that truce it's fragile and it's set to expire early next month. And this trip is an opportunity for Biden to shore up support for that truce, both in Saudi Arabia and with those GCC+3 leaders you reference. I think, right now, probably the biggest obstacle to a more permanent ceasefire is the Houthis. But while he's in Saudi Arabia, Biden can use this time to seek certain moves from the Saudis that would consolidate the ceasefire and make it more palatable for the Houthis to make concessions of their own, namely lifting the Houthi blockade on the city of Taiz. But so we could imagine Biden asking the Saudis to ease their blockade in northern Yemen and allow more fuel to reach Hodeidah. And yes, as you mentioned, it's an opportunity for Biden to seek regional consensus for his objectives in Yemen. My understanding is he'll have a bilat with Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And under the Yemen truce agreement, Egypt agreed to operate direct flights between the Houthi-held airport in Sana'a and Cairo. And the U.S. wants Egypt to step up more of those flights. Biden will also likely talk with the head of Yemen's new Presidential Leadership Council, who will be there as well. And then I guess one other kind of story to watch for is there was a Reuters report that the administration was considering lifting its ban on U.S. sales of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, has pushed back on the report, saying it's not something that's on the table. But in any event, I imagine arms sales and their use in Yemen will be part of Biden's conversations with Saudi leaders.
And just in the breaking news aspect of our visit, President Biden has landed in Saudi Arabia. He was received at the airport by the governor of Mecca, Prince Khalid Al Faisal, and the Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Rima bin Bandar. So the next phase of our trip has already begun. Ben, a question for you. What next from the Israeli side on the Palestinian issue? Is there anything that can be expected now that Biden has left and with elections coming up in a few months? You're on mute.
With the election coming up in November 1st, nothing to expect. Is exactly like Daoud said before, the expectations are lowest than ever. Benny Gantz just cooperated with the Gideon Sa'ar from the very far right wing, and Benny Gantz was supposed to be the new Yitzhak Rabin. So there is no Israeli leader that will do something about the peace process before elections. And I'm not sure it will happen after the elections. Right now, the new slogan in Israel, and I think this is going to be on the platform of Gantz and Gideon Sa'ar, is not solving the problem, but managing or maybe shrinking it. Try to hold the fire as low as possible. And you saw it when Israel granted now permissions to build in Area C for the Palestinians and packages of economic assistance and cellular 4 and 5G, but nothing substantial. Each time Benny Gantz was meeting the president, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the government, the late government of Lapid and Bennett paid price because the Israeli public, and I'm not sure we want to talk about it right now in this webinar, is not there anymore. They went to the right wing because of all the disappointments during the decades of peace process after peace process, peace offer after peace offer. It's not the right time to get to blame this side or the other. I personally think both sides are to be blamed, but the situation is that I don't see, not even in the far horizon, a real negotiation. Maybe if a miracle will happen and Meretz will win the elections, but in Meretz we are losing one Knesset member a day. Right now, Tammy Zandberg just resigned and Zahava Galon is coming back, so I'm not a man of good news.
Jared, a question for you. There were reports that Saudi Arabia that the Biden administration would support offensive weapons for Saudi Arabia, that might be on the table in terms of the bilateral discussions. Do you see any movement on that front in terms of the Biden administration support and the challenges that might face in the Congress?
Right. Well, as Elizabeth has noted, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has pushed back on that report from Reuters. Would be interesting to take a look at his exact phrasing. I am told from sources informed on this matter that, in fact, the Biden administration. Am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Yeah, you're okay.
I'll start over. Yeah, as Elizabeth noted, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan pushed back on that report. It would be interesting to go back and take a look at his precise wording. I have been told by sources informed on the matter that the administration is revisiting this. It's unlikely to be at this time a policy change. However, you might see what you might see in the coming weeks and months is a sort of tone shift out of the administration. Obviously, the line between offensive and defensive weapons can get quite a bit blurry, as we've seen over the past year with these AMRAAM air-to-air missile sales to Saudi Arabia. Obviously, the administration can expect resistance in Congress, but yeah, it remains to be seen how they choose to approach this. I mean, I am told there is a very significant backlog in the several tens of billions of FMS, obviously to Saudi Arabia, and the Emiratis, of course, want even more. This is a point of leverage that the administration, if they are able to deliver, which is very unlikely on this trip, which the administration could use to build trust with these Gulf states, to reassure them that the United States is, has their back militarily. Obviously, this would go against the administration's stated policy, but again, it will be interesting to see how they thread this needle.
We are just about out of time, but Dawood, I wanted to get this question in for you. What are the expectations among Palestinians, Palestinian people, as well as the Palestinian leadership about the Palestinian issue being part of the GCC+3 summit?
Well, they're hoping. King Abdullah and Mahmoud Abbas have been in contact recently, because King Abdullah has usually been the strongest spokesman for Palestinians when the Palestinians are not present. So they're hoping that, the Americans want lower oil prices, but they want to try to push Biden to make some kind of further gesture, not financial, but a political gesture. And especially those countries that have started normalization, they're under a lot of trouble internally. And so they want to show that, as Biden said himself, that normalization actually will help the peace process. So there has to be somehow a stronger statement in terms of the US pushing for a return to the peace talks. I know Ben said it's not going to happen, but miracles do happen in the Holy Land. So yes, we want to have talks back, and we want the occupation to end. The problem is Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, has made a commitment of 1 year last October at the UN, saying if nothing happens, things will change, and what will change could be that there will be less security cooperation, which means that the situation might get out of hand, and many Israelis will not like that. It's not the threat, but it's what Abu Mazen is saying, that he cannot keep going, losing public support, because he's been the single defender of the nonviolent approach, and he has been punished rather than rewarded. So Palestinians want to end of occupation. Mahmoud Abbas said it 4 times today. All we want is to end the occupation. And whether the Israelis want to do it in negotiations or unilaterally, there has to be an end to occupation.
We are out of time. I want to thank our journalists today, Ben Caspin, Tel Aviv, Dawood Kutab from Jerusalem, Elizabeth Hagedorn here in Washington, Jared Suba in New York. And thanks to all of our viewers who tuned in. Please continue to follow all of the news and trends on the Middle East at Al-Monitor.com, and check out our Premium Pro offering for more exclusive briefings like this one today, as well as memos by many of the top business, economic, and geopolitical experts covering the region. Thank you all for tuning in.